The night before the biggest defense technology summit in Austin, Carson Wade sent a company-wide email calling Dominion the future of military cybersecurity. He was right about one thing. It was going to change everything. Just not for him. I was sitting at my kitchen table when that email landed, and I read it twice while my coffee went cold beside me. My wife Sarah was already asleep down the hall. The house was quiet in that particular way it gets when someone you love has been sick for a long time. When even silence has a weight to it. I read Carson's email a third time, looked at his name, signed in, bold, at the bottom, and felt something settle inside my chest. Not anger. Anger had come and gone weeks ago. What I felt now was closer to certainty. He had built Dominion on my work. He had filed federal paperwork claiming it as Apex property. And tomorrow afternoon, he was going to stand on a stage in front of defense journalists, procurement officers, and Department of Defense representatives, and try to demonstrate a system that would not function without the encryption architecture he had stolen and did not understand. I closed my laptop, finished the cold coffee, and went to bed. I slept fine. But let me take you back, because the story does not start with Carson Wade. It starts much earlier, with a 22-year-old kid from Georgia who joined the Navy because he believed in something larger than himself, and who never quite stopped believing that. My name is Marcus Henderson. Everyone who has mattered in my life calls me Mac. I am 52 years old. I have a gray beard that my daughter Emma has been complaining about since she was 14. And I have spent the better part of 3 decades building cybersecurity architecture for systems that protect soldiers in places most people cannot find on a map. After the Navy, I joined Apex Defense Technologies in Austin, Texas, as a junior programmer. I had a cheap suit, a second-hand laptop I had upgraded 3 times with my own money, and one habit I had developed in the military that never left me. I documented everything. Every decision, every file, every timestamp. In the Navy, you learn fast that an undocumented action might as well not have happened. That discipline followed me into every line of code I ever wrote. Over 25 years, I became the senior cybersecurity engineer that Apex called when the work could not fail. Encryption systems for field communications, threat response protocols for classified networks, authentication layers for systems used in active combat zones. I was never the man in the press releases. I was the man who made sure the press releases never had to include the words critical failure. I was not chasing titles. I did not want a corner office or a spot at executive dinners. I wanted to build things that worked. And I wanted to go home to my family. That was my world when Carson Wade arrived. Carson was 28 years old and had been at Apex for 11 months when the company promoted him to Vice President of Innovation. His father was on the board. That detail was not hidden. Exactly. But it was spoken in the way people speak about something they have decided not to argue with. Carson had an MBA from a school that cost more per semester than most engineers made in a year. A collection of startup buzzwords he deployed like furniture in a showroom. And a confidence that had never once been tested by a genuine consequence. He appeared on screen that first Monday morning via company video call, smiling from a glass-walled Dallas office with a skyline behind him and a slide deck full of words like operational alignment and next-generation collaboration. I watched him from my home office in Austin, which was the room beside our kitchen, close enough that I could hear Sarah moving slowly down the hallway, hear the click of the pill bottles on the counter, hear the kettle whistle when she made her tea. I was working from home because of Sarah. Her cancer treatment had been going on for 7 months, and the days after her sessions were the kind of days when she needed someone in the house. Apex had approved the arrangement because my output never dropped. In fact, the quantum encryption project I had been leading had cleared every Department of Defense benchmark for 18 consecutive months. Numbers do not lie. And mine said I was doing the job. Carson did not care about the numbers. He cared about control. The policy he announced that Monday was simple in the way that a closing trap is simple. Starting the following week, every research and development employee had to return to the office full-time. No exceptions. See? He smiled when he said it. Just smiled. The way a man smiles when he knows the words he is using have teeth, but cannot be argued with directly. The screen went quiet. I watched my colleagues freeze with those careful expressions people wear when a decision has been made above their level and they are calculating how much it will cost them to disagree. I sat with my hands flat on my desk and said nothing, because I already knew the rest of the sentence. Then Carson clicked to the next slide. Every prototype, every source file, every technical document, every access credential tied to research and development had to be uploaded immediately into a centralized corporate repository for what Carson called patent consolidation. That was the phrase, patent consolidation. I have spent 25 years around classified systems and defense contracts. I know the difference between a policy that protects a company and a policy that is designed to take something from someone who built it. This was the second kind. Carson wanted every valuable idea inside Apex pulled under his name and under Apex's legal umbrella before anyone could establish prior ownership. And the project that would anchor that strategy was mine. I unmuted my microphone. I kept my voice completely flat. Carson, I said, does this policy apply to work developed outside standard contract parameters? He smiled wider. The smile of a man who is prepared for the slow-moving questions from the old engineers. Mac. Anything relevant to Apex Defense's strategic roadmap falls under company purview. Even if it was built with no company equipment, no company time, and no company personnel. The call went still for a half second. Not long, but I had worked with enough people to know when a room changed. Carson leaned back in his leather chair and said the sentence that would cost him everything. Once it's integrated into our systems, it becomes company property. That's how defense contracting works. Nobody responded. Not one person unmuted to push back, ask a follow-up, or even clear their throat. Tommy Reeves, my junior engineer, the 24-year-old who reminded me of myself at that age, was staring at something just off camera with an expression like a man watching a car roll slowly toward a wall. I looked directly into my camera and smiled. Thanks for clarifying the exit strategy, Carson. Then I closed my laptop. There is a version of that moment where I pack my desk in slow, dramatic silence. Say, where I take my time and feel every second of 25 years. That is not what happened. I had already packed the box weeks before. I had already known this conversation was coming. Because men like Carson always eventually say the quiet part out loud. They cannot help it. The arrogance is structural. I picked up the box, walked to the elevator, and in the lobby I ran into Tommy, who had clearly sprinted from the conference room. His badge was still swinging. His face was pale. Mac, he said, barely above a whisper. What are you doing? I looked at him for a moment. Tommy was sharp, loyal, and still young enough to believe that bad decisions could be fixed by explaining them carefully to the right people. I wanted to tell him everything, but truth has weight, and I needed him light enough to move. Stay, I said. Observe. Document everything. His face changed. He understood enough to be afraid. The elevator opened. I stepped in. The doors closed. Outside, the Austin heat hit like a wall, but I felt lighter than I had in months. I walked to my truck, set the box in the back, and opened the locked toolbox behind the cab. Inside was a sealed envelope I had prepared 3 weeks earlier, addressed in block letters to Colonel Sam Hartwell at the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. That envelope was not a complaint. It was not a memo or a grievance. It was a file. Timelines, filings, development records, and documentation showing exactly who owned the technology Carson thought he was about to fold into Apex's portfolio. The project was called Ghost Protocol. That name was mine too. I had started building Ghost Protocol 11 months earlier. In the hours that existed between everything else, midnight, 4 in the morning, weekend afternoons, the long stretches in hospital waiting rooms while Sarah slept through her treatment sessions in a recliner chair with a thin cotton blanket pulled up to her chin. I would sit with my personal laptop open on a plastic chair, writing code while the IV drip counted down beside her. And I would think about encryption architecture the way other people think about prayers, as something you build carefully because the thing you are protecting matters more than you do. Not one line of Ghost protocol was written on Apex hardware. Not one test was run on an Apex server. Not one Apex employee reviewed a single function. Variable, or comment, in the codebase. I use my own machine, my own home network, my own development environment, and my own money for every piece of infrastructure the project touched. And because I was a Navy man who had watched undocumented claims dissolve under pressure, I kept receipts, Git commit histories with timestamps that predated my Apex employment by months, hardware purchase receipts, dated lab notebooks, witness statements from 2 colleagues who had watched me work on personal projects during off hours for years, email threads between me and my attorney timestamped well before any Apex policy document was written. Carson thought he was taking company property. Ghost Protocol had never been company property. It had never been anyone's property but mine, protected under federal intellectual property filings that I had completed quietly, months before Carson's name ever appeared on an org chart. The day I left Apex, I drove directly to Kevin Reeves's office. Kevin and I had gone to college together before he went into military law and eventually built one of the cleaner intellectual property practices in Texas. He was the kind of lawyer who read documents the way surgeons read scans, looking for the thing that was not supposed to be there. He answered the phone on the second ring. Mac, tell me you are not calling about phishing. Activate the contingency plan. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from him watching him move through the documentation. Patent filings, development logs, timestamp records, witness statements, hardware receipts. When he reached the last page, he closed the folder and sat back in his chair and looked at me with the expression of a man who has been handed something much better than he expected. This is not just strong, Mac. This is airtight. I nodded. I had not driven across Austin hoping to hear that. I already knew it. What I needed Kevin for was what came next. He opened a second folder. Have you seen this? The name printed across the top was Dominion. Apex Defense had been developing Dominion internally for several weeks, positioning it as the company's flagship military cybersecurity product. Carson had presented it during a quarterly review with the kind of confidence that only comes from a man building on a foundation he did not lay himself. Real-time threat assessment, adaptive encryption, autonomous defense response. Every feature in his slide deck traced back, architecturally, to my work. Dominion was Ghost Protocol, wearing an Apex logo. Kevin turned to the technical comparison he had prepared. Same base encryption structure, same authentication pathway, same core threat assessment logic. Whoever had been tasked with reverse engineering my architecture had either been sloppy, overconfident, or both. The fingerprints were not subtle. They were the same fingerprints, lifted from the same surfaces, placed in a new frame and hung on a different wall. They are not borrowing from your work, Kevin said quietly. They are building their entire summit demonstration around it. He paused, then asked the question I had been waiting for. What happens if they try to run Dominion without your core protocols? I looked at the technical comparison again, then pushed the folder back across his desk. It fails. Not glitches. Not degrades. Not slows down. Fails. Ghost Protocol was not a feature Apex could swap out before a demonstration. It was the foundation. Without my encryption engine, Dominion had no functional threat response capability, no secure authentication layer, no adaptive defense logic. Carson had built a beautiful front entrance attached to a building with no interior structure. The moment anyone tried to step inside and actually use it, the entire thing would collapse. Kevin was quiet for a moment. Muck, what do you want to happen here? I thought about that for a few seconds. Not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to say it carefully. I want the truth to go where it belongs. We filed the federal notification that afternoon. Over the following days, Tommy sent me short, factual messages from inside Apex. He never offered opinions or analysis, which told me he had understood my instructions perfectly. He sent only what he saw. 7 days before the summit, Carson had brought in outside contractors, none of whom seemed to understand what they were looking at. Engineering staff were working 16-hour days. The word he heard most often in the hallways was, "Just make it work," which was not a technical directive but a panic response wearing the clothes of one. 5 days before the summit, the encryption modules were throwing authentication errors nobody could explain, which was correct, because the explanation was not in any file they had access to. 3 days out, 2 senior engineers had quietly suggested postponing the demonstration. Carson had rejected the suggestion without discussion. I read these updates from my back porch in the evenings while Sarah watered her garden and the light went orange over the rooftops. She had a particular way of moving through her garden, slow and deliberate, pausing beside each plant like she was having a conversation with it. I watched her from the steps and thought about what Carson had been trying to take. Not just code, not just a project, the income that kept her treatment stable, the insurance that covered the bills I would otherwise be calculating at 3 in the morning with a legal pad and a pencil, Emma's graduate school fund, the sense that the life I had built with my own hands was still standing. Carson had not understood that. He had thought he was threatening my career. He had been threatening my family. That changes a man's relationship to patience. On Friday morning, 6 days before the summit, Kevin called me with a development I had not anticipated, but probably should have. Apex had filed an emergency ownership claim on Dominion. Not an internal document. Not a memo. A formal federal filing. Signed by Apex Legal and certified as original company-developed intellectual property. Carson had put Apex's name on technology already protected under my filings, and then certified it to the federal government as belonging entirely to Apex. Kevin said the patent office had flagged the conflict almost immediately. Same architecture, same technical foundations, same protected encryption pathway. Overlapping ownership, claims on technology tied to classified defense infrastructure. For a moment, I just sat with that. Then I said, "Kevin, I know. He just signed paperwork. I know. In a civil court, intellectual property theft is a lawsuit. In defense contracting, filing a false ownership claim on protected encryption technology tied to classified military systems is a different category of problem entirely. It was no longer a corporate dispute. It was a federal matter with federal investigators and federal jurisdiction. And Carson had certified it himself with his own signature." Kevin's voice dropped. "Muck, this is not civil court anymore. This crosses into criminal exposure." I was quiet for a long moment. I looked out at Sarah's garden. Then I suppose it was lucky I already sent that envelope. The day before the summit, Colonel Sam Hartwell called me himself. We had served together years earlier, when Hartwell was a Navy lieutenant who believed that sloppy paperwork could sink a mission as thoroughly as enemy fire. He was older now. His voice had more gravel in it, but the discipline had not changed. "Mac," he said, "I reviewed your documentation." I waited. "This is impressive work." Pause. "It also tells me Apex Defense is about to demonstrate technology they cannot legally claim in front of people who need to understand exactly what that means." I looked through the kitchen window at Sarah, checking her plants in the late afternoon light. "Colonel, if they run Dominion tomorrow, it will fail within the first 90 seconds. A long pause. "Then, I suppose, we both need to be there." Saturday morning. I arrived at the Austin Convention Center well before the doors opened to the general floor. I signed in under Marcus A. Henderson, wore a plain baseball cap and a jacket that belonged to another decade, and sat down 3 rows back from the Apex booth with a cup of coffee I did not particularly want and a clear view of everything. Apex had done the booth well. I will give Carson that. The banners were sharp. The branding was expensive. And Dominion had a logo that looked serious and proprietary. Carson arrived in a tailored suit. shaking hands with procurement officers, smiling for journalists, moving through the room with the ease of a man who had convinced himself the performance was already won. Tommy stood a few feet behind him, quiet and pale, watching the demo equipment with the expression of a man standing next to something he knows is about to detonate. I sipped my coffee and watched the room fill. At exactly 2 o'clock, Carson stepped onto the Apex stage. Ladies and gentlemen, today, Apex Defense Technologies will demonstrate the future of military cybersecurity. The screen behind him lit up with the Dominion logo and a wave of animation. The audience leaned in. Journalists opened their laptops. Procurement officers folded their arms. The room had the particular quiet of people who were professionally obligated to pay attention. For the first 30 seconds, Carson got exactly what he wanted. The interface loaded cleanly. Diagnostic readouts scrolled. Charts climbed. Numbers moved in the right directions. It looked powerful enough to impress anyone who did not know there was nothing underneath. Then Dominion reached for the core encryption layer. Nothing answered. The screen froze. Red warning text appeared across the center of the display. Authentication failure. Core protocols not found. System integrity compromised. Carson's smile held for 1 second too long. The kind of second that broadcasts everything. Tommy moved to the demo laptop. His fingers were fast, and his face had gone completely white. 2 senior engineers leaned over the backup terminal, whispering commands in the low, urgent voices of men who already know the answer. The backup threw the same error. Of course it did, because there was no backup that contained what was actually missing. The auditorium went quiet enough that I could hear keyboards clicking in the press row. A journalist in the front row said, quietly enough that she was probably speaking to herself, "Did it just fail authentication?" The reporter beside her was already typing. 2 procurement officers closed their notebooks simultaneously. Across the aisle, a competitor's engineer said something to his colleague that made both of them look at Carson and then slowly back at the frozen screen. Carson looked at Tommy, then at the senior engineers, then up at the Dominion logo hanging dead above his head. That was the moment he understood. There was nothing to fix, because the part that needed fixing had never been his to begin with. He stepped off the stage with his jaw set hard enough that I could see the tension in it from 3 rows back. The applause behind him was thin and uncomfortable. The polite kind that people offer when they want a disaster to simply be over. He turned toward the Apex booth, probably already building the explanation in his head. Software glitch. Network environment. Unexpected compatibility issue. Anything but the truth. A man in dress blue stepped into his path. Colonel Hartwell did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He held a manila envelope and looked at Carson with the expression of a man who has already read every document twice. Mr. Wade. Colonel Hartwell. Department of Defense, Inspector General's Office. We need to discuss your company's intellectual property claims. Carson's face moved through 3 expressions in about 4 seconds. Embarrassment. Confusion. Fear. Not the fear of a man who has been caught making a mistake. The fear of a man who has just understood the full architecture of what he walked into. They moved him into a conference room near the exhibition floor. I could not hear the conversation through the glass wall, but I watched Hartwell place documents on the table one by one with the calm patience of someone who already knew every answer. Carson tried denial first. You could read it in his gestures, the way his mouth moved, the sharp shake of his head. Then Hartwell pointed to the filings, the timestamps, the ownership records, the federal certification Carson himself had signed. Carson stopped moving. His shoulders dropped. The posture of a man who has finally counted the evidence against him and found that it is more than he can argue with. I stood up. I finished the last of my cold coffee and walked to the parking garage. My phone buzzed before I reached the truck. Kevin. Federal warrant executed. Apex headquarters. Servers seized. Dominion files secured. I stood beside my truck and read those words once. Then again, not from surprise, from something quieter than that. The sensation of watching something you built carefully and slowly and over a long time. Finally do exactly what you designed it to do. I drove home. The FBI had moved with the kind of efficiency that only comes from an investigation that was already prepared before the warrant was signed. While Carson was still in that conference room trying to explain a failed demonstration, federal agents were inside Apex Defense, imaging hard drives, locking servers, and pulling every internal file connected to Dominion. The centralized repository Carson had created to consolidate stolen intellectual property had become the most complete evidence cabinet the investigators could have asked for. He had done their work for them. 3 days later, the Austin Business Journal ran a headline short enough to be surgical. Defense contractor under federal investigation for IP theft. The article did not need to editorialize. The facts carried enough weight on their own. Apex Defense Technologies, accused of unauthorized use of protected encryption technology. Security clearances under review. Major defense contracts suspended pending investigation. Internal records tied to the failed Dominion demonstration under federal examination. Carson's name appeared in the third paragraph, followed by 7 words that function in business journalism as a polite funeral notice. Could not be reached for comment. By the end of that week, Carson Wade had been removed from Apex Defense so cleanly it looked like someone had used a seam ripper. His glass office was cleared by lunchtime. His name disappeared from the executive directory. HR sent the announcement that corporations send when they need everyone to stop asking questions. A brief note about Carson pursuing other opportunities effective immediately. Other opportunities. The vocabulary of a man whose name now carried the wrong kind of weight in every room where it had once opened doors. Tommy called me from the parking lot the afternoon Carson left. His voice was older than 24. Mac, he said. Nobody's saying it out loud, but everyone knows he's gone. I looked at the coffee cup on my kitchen table and let that sit for a moment. I did not feel the thing I had expected to feel, which was satisfaction. What I felt was closer to relief. The way you feel when a long, complicated project finally compiles and runs clean. Tommy asked to meet me at the same diner where Kevin and I had gone through the original files. He looked like he had not slept properly in a week, which I suspected was accurate. He slid into the booth across from me and stared at his coffee for a moment before he started talking. He wanted advice. He wanted to know what to do with what he had seen. What it meant for his career. How a person was supposed to navigate the wreckage someone else created. I let him talk until he had nothing left to say. Then I told him 3 things. Keep your records clean. Say less than you know. Update your resume tonight. He nodded slowly. Smart kid. 6 weeks later, I walked through the front doors of Blackwater Dynamics in San Antonio with a new badge on my jacket. Marcus A. Henderson, Chief Security Officer. The building was quiet in the particular way that serious work is quiet. Not empty, but focused. No motivational slogans on the walls. No buzzwords in the lobby. Just the American flag. A row of photographs. And the kind of atmosphere that comes from people who understand the mission they are serving. They had not hired me because I survived what happened at Apex. They hired me because I had built something a major defense contractor was willing to risk federal prosecution to steal. That told them everything they needed to know about the value of the work. They gave me a hand-picked team of 12 engineers, full architectural authority over security development, and a compensation package that made Sarah cover her mouth when I told her the number. Mac, she said, that's more than we made in 3 years. She laughed when she said it. I had not heard her laugh like that in months. It was the kind of laugh that belongs to relief. To realizing a weight you had been carrying for so long that you stopped noticing it was finally gone. Sarah's latest screening came back clean. The executive health coverage at Blackwater handled bills that had been keeping me awake long after midnight for the better part of a year. When I called Emma at school and told her graduate school was covered, no loans. No. Compromise. 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 Compromise, 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 compromise. I could hear her try to sound casual and fail completely. She cried a little, which she will deny if you ask her. That was the thing Carson had never understood. When he looked at me on that video call, he saw an aging engineer past his prime. A man who should have been grateful for whatever terms a younger executive decided to offer him. He thought he was threatening my professional pride. He was threatening everything I had built and everyone I was responsible for. And once a man who spent 25 years inside classified military systems understands that the thing threatening his family has a documented paper trail, he stops thinking about anger and starts thinking about architecture. 3 months after the summit, a LinkedIn notification showed me where Carson had landed. The former vice president of innovation at Apex Defense Technologies was now listed as exploring new challenges in client relations at a small insurance office in Plano. I stared at that for a few seconds. Client relation. I closed the tab. I did not hate him enough to celebrate, and I was not built to carry resentment for a man who had already become irrelevant. But I understood what had happened to him in a way that felt complete. Carson had not lost everything in one dramatic moment. His punishment was slower, quieter, and in some ways more thorough than a single consequence would have been. He had lost access. He had lost the trust of every room where defense contractors made decisions that mattered. He had lost the ability to use his father's name to open doors that would now close permanently the moment his history appeared in a background check. He wanted to own my work. Instead, he became a warning. In defense contracting circles, his name is spoken the way people speak about technical failures. Not with contempt, but as a case study in what happens when arrogance replaces judgment at the wrong moment. A few weeks later, Tommy called me from Denver. He had found a position at a small cybersecurity firm, far enough from Austin to feel like a fresh start. "Mac," he said, "I wanted to thank you." I asked him for what. He was quiet for a moment. "For showing me how to fight back without becoming the thing you're fighting." That stayed with me, because it was exactly right. I could have made it personal. I could have pursued this story differently. Called people. Sent emails. Tried to accelerate Carson's fall or make sure he felt me behind every consequence. But that version of the story would have required me to become someone I did not want to be. Anger is energy, and energy is finite. And I had more valuable things to protect. I did not need to destroy Carson. I needed to tell the truth and let the evidence do the rest. Those are very different projects. And only one of them leaves you intact at the end. Every morning now, I walk through the lobby at Blackwater Dynamics, past the flag and the photographs, and I badge through a door that Carson Wade could not open on his best day. Ghost Protocol is classified at levels I am not permitted to discuss in any public setting. And the Department of Defense has already requested 3 additional versions. Sarah's garden is full this season. Emma is halfway through her graduate program. And for the first time in years, I sleep without doing financial calculations in the dark at 3 in the morning. Sometimes I think back to that video call. Carson smiling as he told me I could resign if I could not adapt to his new policies. He said it as an insult. He meant it as a dismissal. Turns out it was the best career advice I ever received. Delivered by a man who had no idea he was unlocking something. He would spend the rest of his professional life wishing he had left alone. Because the best revenge is not always watching someone fall. Sometimes it is walking forward so far and so deliberately that they can no longer see the life they tried to take from you. If I learned one thing from all of this, it is the thing the Navy taught me 25 years before Carson Wade was ever relevant to my story. Document everything. Not because you are paranoid, not because you expect betrayal, but because truth without proof is just a story someone powerful can deny. And men like Carson are very practiced at denial. He had a title, a corner office, and his father's name on the building. I had timestamps, federal filings, witnesses, a sealed envelope, and the patience to wait until the right afternoon. Patience won. So if you are ever underestimated, if someone with a better title or a louder voice or a name on the door decides that what you built belongs to them now, stay calm. Protect your work. Keep your records clean. Say less than you know, and never confuse silence with weakness. People like Carson mistake quiet for surrender. They mistake a man who does not react for a man who does not know what is happening. But sometimes, the stillest person in the room is the only one who kept every receipt. If this story stayed with you, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me, would you have stayed quiet and let the evidence build, the way Mac did? Or would you have confronted Carson the moment he announced that policy? There is no wrong answer. I am genuinely curious where you fall. And if you want more stories about the kind of patience that turns betrayal into justice, subscribe to the channel. Every story here is about the moment someone underestimated the wrong person and found out exactly how wrong they were.